Well, Ron, welcome once again to my underground bunker as we get to discuss another fantastic study that you guys have produced. I'm grateful. By the way, I know, I think I know where you're coming from, but tell our listeners where you're coming from.
You're talking about geographically?
Yeah.
Yes, I am coming from the mighty metropolis of Alcobaça, Portugal.
Wow. Well, that's pretty remarkable. I've never been to Portugal, been to Spain. So, thanks. I know it's a whole lot later there than it is here. So, I'm grateful for you working with the time change to be on today. And talk to me about this new study that you guys have produced. Uh, just what are the headlines?
Well, the study is called the generosity landscape, and it is part of our continued partnership with Infinity Concepts, which is a marketing services agency that is like Gray Matter Research focuses on serving the Christian community. So this study is part of it is an ongoing measurement of the generosity, tracking the generosity of evangelicals. But then we also took the opportunity to, in the world of giving, look at a few different things that we have not touched on before, such as volunteering, such as digital church and its impact on church giving, and some other topics like that. And so we did look at, and that's why we called it the landscape. We did try to get, rather than just touching on one specific topic, we did try to get kind of a broader view of the landscape among evangelical Protestants.
And I want to talk about digital church and volunteering a little bit later on, but I want to stick to the study itself because I read. I guess as a journalist, I'm sort of an amateur demographer and an amateur statistician, and I say that very amateur, but I'm fascinated by this stuff, and so I follow it, and I continue to be, I don't know, Ron, disheartened maybe by the low level of giving that evangelicals have. I mean, the good news, I guess, if there's any good news in this year's study, is that after 4 or 5 years of decline, it appears maybe to be bottoming out, but it's bottoming out at a very low. It started at a low level and it fell to an even lower level. It seems to me. Am I reading this right?
You are reading it quite correctly, Warren. The reality is that I always get amused when people talk about fine points or argue about fine points of the tithe. Does a tithe mean giving to your church, and anything above that that would go to a whatever, a convoy of hope or a global Christian relief? That's not part of your tithe. That can't be part of your tithe. Is the tithe on the net or on the gross? There are all these theological arguments. And the point that I make is let's not bother. Let's not bother with these theological arguments, because the truth is nobody's tithing. 9% of evangelicals give anything close to a tithe. And we look at a tithe and we give a little bit of grace because we realize when we're asking people about their income, about their giving, they're not giving us exact numbers. They're not going to tell us, well, my income last year was $58,936.12. They're going to tell us it was in the 50 to 59,000 range. And the same thing with their giving. So we know that these are estimates and there's a little play. So we look at tithing as 8% or higher, even though biblically we're well aware it's 10% or higher. But because it is an estimate, don't want to take somebody that the estimate chipped a little bit away from the reality and now say they're not tithing. But the reality is, when we look at 8% or higher, it is about 9% of evangelicals who give at that level. And that includes church and charity. So if for those who would justifying tithing is going to the church, then it would be even lower than that. And this is on the gross annual household income. So for those who would define it as um, tithing on the net income, it would be a little bit higher than this.
Yeah.
But the reality is we're talking decimal dust either way. The average evangelical, when we include church and charitable giving, is giving about 2.2% of household income. Now, you mentioned the possibly arrested or bottoming out, the arrested decline. We started tracking this, unfortunately, in 2020, right in the middle of COVID. Now, COVID had a really interesting dynamic on giving because when COVID hit, nonprofits were no different than all the businesses out there going, oh no, what is got people are not going to give. They can't go to work. Servers are the restaurants are shuttered, the churches are shuttered. There's no commerce going on. Well, the fascinating thing is that giving increased significantly in 2020 compared to past years because A, people saw real serious need. B, they had nowhere to go spend their excess money. I can't go to Starbucks and pick up a latte. I can't go to Buffalo Wild Wings and watch the game with my friends. I can't go shopping and buy a new tie, whatever. All right, I've got extra money. And there was government surplus there, not surplus, but government stimulus, excuse me. So it created a perfect condition for giving to go way up. But we started measuring it at that top level. And so we don't know if the decline over the next 5 years was taking it back to, at least among evangelicals, taking it back to where it was previously before COVID, taking it back and it's still higher, or taking it down below where it was. We just don't have those numbers. We do
Right.
know among the American population in general, and we've measured this compared to 2018, that today's giving is considerably lower than it was in 2018 as a proportion of household income. Well, for the first time in measuring this almost every year, we did see no substantial change in proportion of evangelicals giving or in how much they're giving as a proportion of household income. Now, whether that's a bottoming out and we're going to see things rise, whether that's a bottoming out and it'll stay flat, or whether that's a just, it hit a shelf on the way down and it's going to keep dropping, we have no idea. Hopefully, we'll be measuring this again and we'll have an answer to that. But right now, at least, that precipitous drop has been stopped or paused.
Yeah, yeah. And just again to reiterate some numbers, only 1.66% of evangelicals um, give tithe to their church, and those the combined giving to church and charity um, is 2.22%, a decline of 31% in just the last 5 years or so. Those are, like I say, to me, those are pretty discouraging numbers. There's another. Let's talk a little bit about the virtual church because one of the things that you found out was that people who attend virtual church are even worse, if I could put it that way, in terms of their giving. That they're hardly giving to church at all. Do I have that right?
You do have that right. And there's a very strong correlation between frequency of in-person attendance and support of the church. So among evangelicals who typically attend at least once a week, 84% financially support their church at some level. When attendance drops to 1 to 3 times a month, giving drops to 69% who actually support their church. Among people who attend church but go less than once a month, so they're the sporadic, the occasional attendees, it's 39% give to church. We see digital church having multiple uses. Some people use it as an occasional, I have a bad throat, I've got a sick kid, my wife just broke her leg and can't get around, whatever that may be. So I'm going to attend digitally as a substitute, and I'm going to attend my church digitally. And it's just a substitute. I'll be back as soon as I can be back. You have other evangelicals who supplement. So they're regularly attending an in-person church, but then they also pop around the internet or pop around the TV landscape and see what else is out there. And then you have 17% of evangelicals who primarily, quote unquote, attend church virtually, primarily or exclusively. When evangelicals have digital church as their primary method of church going, just 37% financially support any church. So, and those who attend infrequently not only are less likely to give, but the ones who do give are half as generous as the regular churchgoers, and virtual churchgoers are about one third as generous. The few who do give are one third as generous as the weekly people in the pews. So, virtual church, yes, it may be reaching more people. It may be giving people an option when they're sick. It may be reaching shut-ins who literally can't, they're bedridden, whatever, but it is having a significant impact on church finances.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, Ron, what I'm about to say is beyond the scope of your study, but there's a big part of me that says, if you're not given to church and you're not attending church and you are not participating in the life of the church in other ways, um, why do you call yourself a Christian? Why do you call yourself an evangelical? Those are, I think, definitional problems beyond the scope of our financial conversation today. But when you're looking at this data, does that ever strike you as well?
Well, first of all, we don't define evangelicals by what they call themselves. Many of these people literally would not call themselves evangelicals. We've defined that in a couple of different ways. Basically, would you voluntarily call yourself an evangelical? Is this just how you identify yourself? And among people with evangelical beliefs, the majority say that they don't, just as a matter of course, use that term to describe themselves. We basically say, okay, when the rubber meets the road, yes or no, would you define yourself as an evangelical if you were specifically asked? And 27% still say, no, I would not define myself as an evangelical. Some of those truly don't even know what an evangelical is. They don't know what the definition is. Or they think it's, for instance, a Pentecostal and they're not Pentecostal. Or it's a somebody, they confuse the word with an evangelist and they say, I don't tell people about Jesus enough to consider myself an evangelist. So I'm not evangelical. But so it's not a matter of what they call themselves. These are people who strongly agree in four key evangelical beliefs: the primacy of the Bible in their lives, the salvation by grace alone, the responsibility to tell others about Jesus. I mean, these are core evangelical beliefs as defined by the National Association of Evangelicals. And so it doesn't matter what they call themselves or what they consider themselves or what they want others to call them. It's what their beliefs are. And these are all
Yeah,
people who very strongly hold to these beliefs. But what we see, I mean, I'm sure all of your listeners know people out there who will rail at the television about what Trump is doing or about what Biden did or what, and yet they don't go out and vote, right? And so, or they will just rail at the processed foods that are out there and the nutrition is horrible and blah, 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 and they're 75 pounds overweight. So, I mean,
right, right.
people, there's what we believe and what we hold true, and then there's what we actually do about it. And those are two
Yeah,
very different things. And one thing to connect all this back to giving, what we consistently find, and this has been every time we have done research like this, um, the single greatest predictor of generosity is the level of spiritual engagement that people have. And we define that by the frequency of Bible readership, Bible study beyond readership, church attendance, prayer, and involvement in a small group, whether that's a study group, a prayer group, whatever that may be. People who immerse themselves in their spirituality, in their faith, are dramatically more generous than people who read the Bible once a week, go to church when it's nice and sunny out, and there are no obstacles to them going, don't bother to go to a small group, and they say grace once, before every meal. It's the and this is something that churches really need to think about because so much of I was just talking to another reporter who was asking about what would you tell pastors about that tithing sermon. And I said, well, you just hit the head on one of the problems. It's that tithing sermon Stewardship, giving, tithing, generosity are so frequently treated as a separate topic in churches. We're going Sunday school, we're going to be doing a 6 week course on stewardship because it's a separate topic. It's not connected to the rest of Christianity, right? We find that it's a matter not of increasing giving, it's a matter of increasing Christian commitment. And when there's a higher level of Christian involvement and Christian commitment, giving automatically goes up. Now,
Yeah.
still nowhere close to the levels that one might expect, but still the single greatest predictor of high generosity is spiritual engagement.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, Ron, first of all, I think your assessment there was, totally consistent with our reporting here at Ministry Watch and what I've been seeing for many years in following this topic. And I think in some ways that's what's discouraging about it is that the level of giving is so low and the level of giving is so closely tied to spiritual engagement and spiritual, what I would say, spiritual formation and maturity that, it tells me that the evangelical church and the Christian church generally is kind of a mile wide and an inch deep, but that we really are not very deep spiritually, because if we were, that would be showing up in our giving, and it's not.
Yep. And it would be showing up in our volunteering. It would be showing up in our church attendance. It would be showing up in our witnessing. It would be showing up in a lot of areas,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's just not.
Well, we don't have an unlimited amount of time, Ron. So let me pivot because you mentioned volunteerism, and that's one of the areas that y'all looked at in your study this year, which I thought was interesting. Again, what are some of the headlines in volunteerism, and how does that relate to giving?
Well, there were two things that we really uncovered that spoke to myths that are pretty common in not just the Christian world, but in the country in general. One, and nonprofits, churches, ministries will hear this all the time. I don't give my money, I give my time. I volunteer instead of giving. Well, that is pure, unmitigated cop out. Don't believe it. Among evangelicals, 2% of evangelicals volunteer but do not give any money at all. It just it isn't true. So when you have somebody who says, I don't give money, I give time. No, what they really mean is I don't give. Period. End of story. But this is my excuse. I'll use it as my rationalization for why I'm not going to talk further with you about supporting your organization or your church or your cause. The other thing that is a very common myth is if you want something done, ask a senior, ask an older person because they are the lifeblood of volunteering. Now, we didn't look at different kinds of volunteering. We didn't look at amount of volunteering, whether it's, 2 hours a week or 30 hours a week. But we actually saw the obvious. The most likely to volunteer are young adults. The least likely to volunteer are the oldest evangelicals. So maybe churches need to start providing different opportunities for seniors to volunteer.
Hmm.
For instance, if they're going to be manning, I don't know, if you're going to have a booth at a fair and they're going to be staffing that booth, 70-year-old knees may need a place to sit down rather than standing for 3 hours. So, do you provide that? Do you take into account they are probably going to need more frequent bathroom breaks? And I'm not trying to stereotype older people, but hey, I'm an older person at this point. I'm on that cusp, and I'm already seeing some physical differences.
Yeah.
So we have to take into account if you want older people to lead Bible studies or do things that require reading, do you have larger print stuff for those who need it? And do you ask older people to help so much that you're burning them out? And you've got these younger people over there that are just all ready to go, but you're also maybe not taking into account their specialized needs. You need to work around kids. You need to work around work. You need to work around maybe they don't have the same level of confidence, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
you need to take into account all these different things and think about, am I just going to the well too often with these same people? What can I do to engage more people?
Ron, we need to kind of bring our conversation to a close here, and I just wanted to ask a couple of, maybe application questions, if I could. What's your, based on this data, what would you say to donors, and what would you say to ministry leaders if you had to boil it down to one or two pieces of advice to each of those two groups?
For donors, what we just finished, now this work was with Infinity Concepts, but Gray Matter Research just finished a separate study called The Average American Donor. And we looked at some of these things among just donors in general. And one of the things we found is that when donors are asked to estimate how much money did you give last year, we can correlate that with other studies, other factors, other data points, and they actually give us a pretty accurate number. When you ask them what proportion of your household income did you give away, they wildly inflate it. Three, four, five times what the actual proportion is. And the group among all Americans that is most likely to inflate it and inflates it the most is Protestant Christians, which to me is a suggestion that they're subconsciously wanting to reach that tithe that they hear about. And so they're mentally inflating it in order to feel better. Well, if you already think you're close to a tithe, why give more? So for donors, I would say take a look at what your giving is. Forget percentages for the moment. Take a look at how much you earned, how much you gave away, and then calculate the percentage. Or say how much do you think is reasonable? What is your target? My target, you know what? I know I can't reach 10%. I got two kids in college, whatever. 5%. That's my target. Well, then calculate it. Oh, I'm at 1%. Hmm, what do I need to do? And if you're way far away, don't try to, don't go in there saying, I got to lose 200 pounds. Go in there saying, okay, maybe lifelong I got to lose 200 pounds. But right now, what do I do to lose 15 this year? So if you're 1%, your target is 5, what can you do to get 1.5? What can you do to get 2? Take baby steps. Big thing is not, am I there yet? The big thing is, what can I do to increase it?
Yeah.
For leaders, what can we do to reframe the conversation? People don't naturally talk about things in terms of proportions. In the Old Testament, when they were measuring out grain or counting sheep, you could pretty easily figure out what 10% is. Today, if I asked you, how much money do you spend on gasoline in a typical month? You could probably give me a reasonable number, reasonable estimate. If I asked you what proportion of your income do you spend on gasoline, you probably couldn't give me anything close to reasonable because that's not how you think of money. So, what can we do to reframe the conversation? And instead of this is my annual tithing sermon or this is my annual giving sermon, what can we do so that tithing naturally or giving naturally emerges from a deeper relationship with God? And it's not, I'm supposed to give this X amount or I'm supposed to give so I check the box. It's a reframing of, you don't sit down, or hopefully you don't sit down and read the Bible because you're supposed to. You do it because you want to learn more about this person you have this relationship with, right?
Yep.
Giving can be the same thing. But we so often see it as the Bible commands this, the church needs this, you need to do this, rather than reframing the conversation. And there are so many curricula, there are so many books, there's so many articles, there's so many different ways, so many sermons on tithing, and yet the average evangelical is giving 2.2%. So what
Yes.
we're doing right now isn't working. It's time to rethink the conversation and the approach.
And that's a good word. And of course, it's part of what we try to do here at Ministry Watch every day to try to help people become more faithful stewards and to understand the joy of giving. And I really appreciate the work that you've done to put some hard numbers to some of these ideas. They've been very helpful to me, and I hope they'll be helpful to our listeners today. So, Ron, thanks so much for being on the program today. I'm grateful.
As always, it was a pleasure, Warren.